This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Tuesday, China released its official GDP figures for the first quarter of 2023. According to the data, the Chinese economy outperformed expectations, with year-on-year GDP growth at 4.5% and stronger than expected consumption. Retail sales were up 5.5%, while industrial production was up just 3%. This came as a bit of a shock to most analysts, including the IMF, who have been cutting their Chinese growth forecasts for the past few years, and reopened questions about the validity of Chinese GDP data. So in this video, we're going to explain why you can't really trust China's GDP data, why that nonetheless doesn't deny China's growth miracle, and why, even if the latest data is somewhat overstated, it's still undeniably good news for the Chinese economy. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with the big question. Can you trust China's GDP data? Well, the short answer is no, or at least not really. This isn't some xenophobic conspiracy either. According to US diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks, back in 2010, China's current premier Li Keqiang told American diplomats that China's GDP figures were, quote, for reference only, and described regional GDP data as man-made. China has even arrested local officials for overstating. Accordingly, researchers have compared China's stated GDP figures to various proxies for economic activity and found large discrepancies. For example, take a look at this study comparing GDP figures to the brightness of countries' lights at night as measured by satellites from 2002 until 2021. Now, this might sound arbitrary, but the brightness of countries' lights at night is actually a pretty good proxy for GDP. The study found that in so-called free countries where GDP data is often subject to some sort of oversight, and therefore much harder to falsify, the brightness of a country's lights at night almost perfectly tracks their GDP figures. The study then compared this to partly free and not free countries, and found that, in general, the less free a country is, the more likely it is to exaggerate GDP data, with China being one of the worst offenders. According to the brightness of its lights at night, China's actual GDP growth in the 20 or so years was something like 175%. China's official GDP figures, on the other hand, claim that the Chinese economy has grown by about 375%. Now, we should say here that the study is particularly unflattering, and other studies, using other proxies for economic activity like shipping rates, have found less discrepancy with official figures. So why does China overstate its GDP figures? Well, some people naturally conclude that this is because the CCP are basically just lying autocrats, but that's not quite right. The real reason China's GDP is unreliable is because, unlike basically every other country, China's GDP is an input into the system, not an output. In most of the world, GDP growth is measured as an output by statistical authorities at the end of the year, and it just records the change in economic activity from the previous year. In China, instead of measuring it at the end of the year, the central government actively sets GDP targets for regional government at the beginning of the year. Usually, the CCP sets pretty high targets, both to keep unemployment low and impress international markets. Local governments then have to find ways of meeting these targets, even if that requires artificially stimulating growth. Usually, local governments do this by borrowing heavily against the value of their land sales and investing that money into expensive infrastructure projects. Even if these debts are unsustainable, i.e. even if the region doesn't need the new infrastructure, infrastructure counts as investment, and investment is a component of GDP, so it pushes GDP up. This is why local government debt has expanded so rapidly in recent years. IMF data shows that China's explicit local government debt has nearly doubled in just 5 years to over 35 billion yuan. And this doesn't include other so-called shadow debts incurred by local governments through unofficial channels, most notably local government financing vehicles. If they're worried about debt, local officials sometimes just resort to lying about their GDP figures to appease Beijing. A 2019 study found that officials across the country have been overstating GDP by lying about capital investment numbers. And the CCP even arrested officials in Inner Mongolia for overstating local GDP. You get the idea. The reason that China's GDP figures are untrustworthy is fundamentally because they're an input into the system set by Beijing, not an output as in the rest of the world. This creates powerful incentives for local governments to either artificially generate GDP by taking out massive debts, or occasionally lie about it. The main implication here is not that China's growth is significantly overstated. Local officials generally prefer to take out more debt instead of risk jail by lying to Beijing, but that it's very unbalanced. In most countries, when GDP goes up, it's driven by a combination of investment and consumption. In China, it's mostly investment. This is bad news for a variety of reasons, not least because it ends up increasing China's debt burden. But to be fair, it still counts as GDP. After all, even if they're not productive investments, these roads and railways are still getting built. This might explain why, returning to the earlier part of this video, China fails the brightness of lights at night test of GDP, but not the shipping average test. Because consumption and disposable income is low. Your average Chinese citizen doesn't consume enough electricity to keep their lights on overnight. But because investment and construction is strong, there's a lot of shipping activity. And this is why the recent figures are still good news for China. Even if the headline GDP figure of 4.5% is overstated, the fact that retail sales were up over 5.8% year-on-year and 10.6% in March, in other words, that consumption is driving most of the recent growth, is really good news for the CCP, who know that their growth is unbalanced and have been trying to increase consumption share of GDP in recent years. This is partly because China literally can't export to other places at the moment. America is trying to decouple from China at the moment, and European growth is lagging, which means that Chinese companies have to focus more and more on selling their domestic markets. All in all, while we should take China's GDP numbers with a pinch of salt, they're not wholly unreliable, and the most recent data bodes well. These are all clearly huge decisions, but one much smaller, easier decision you can make is improving your skills and career prospects with Brilliant.org. That's because while we all know that the promise of AI is that it'll make our lives easier, it's very possible it'll make our work lives more difficult, replacing some people and requiring different skills of others. Brilliant, however, is the best way of improving your STEM skills quickly and in a fun way, investing in your own human intelligence. That's because Brilliant has thousands of lessons, from foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision-making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. And by the way, these lessons are interactive and engaging, designed around principles of active learning, so there's no boring lectures here. That means that by investing a few minutes every day in lifelong learning, you can improve your skills and feel a real sense of accomplishment. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer, free for a full 30 days, by clicking on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.